the National Juried Exhibition this year, we had more submissions than we've ever had before, like by far. And poor Kyle had to work through, let me get the number here, 826 pieces by 305 artists. So artists could submit up to 3 pieces. And when they were coming in, I'm like, man, I probably should have warned Kyle ahead of time. I think last year's show, we had 500 and some. And we've been pushing marketing in some different ways, so we got a bunch, just a bunch. Man, and I felt so bad for Kyle, but he did a great job. So if you're one of the artists in the National Juried Exhibition, would you raise your hand? Congratulations for being in the show. Kyle selected 55 pieces. I think a couple artists couldn't actually end up being a part, so I think there's 53 pieces in the exhibition, and 13 different states are represented in the exhibition. So it's a really good sampling of work, I think. Kyle will be announcing the award winners. There's a first place, second, third, and honorable mention, and we'll get into awards here in a little bit. But let me tell you a little bit about Kyle Hackett. Kyle is an assistant professor of art at the American University in Washington, D.C. He earned his MFA from the Leroy E. Hofberger School of Painting at MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and his BFA in Fine Arts as a McNair Scholar from the University of Delaware. Kyle has received numerous honors and awards. He's been featured in multiple publications. His work is represented by Goya Contemporary Gallery in Baltimore and notably collected by Ethan Cohen Gallery in New York, Wangechi Mutu Studio and museums at the University of Delaware, the University of Maryland, DC Commission of the Arts and Humanities, Capital One Lounge's permanent collection at the Washington Dulles International Airport, the Trawick Foundation, and more. Would you all give it up for Kyle Hackett?
Thank you, Corey, who disappeared. I was like, wait a minute. The Delaplane Arts Center, for everybody who helped make this possible. Clearly, we don't do it alone, and it takes a team. And so it's really great to see the work I saw online here today in its material form. I'll kind of talk a little bit about my process of looking at work and jurying, right, this record of submissions, which has been a privilege. And, I'll do that after I share more about my work. But I just want to say thank you to all the artists for putting your voices, putting your work out in the world, and submitting. It certainly was a privilege to review what you've shared, and a difficult task for sure to narrow things down. I'll talk to you a little bit about my trajectory as an artist and my research. So I'll set that up. I'll probably spend a little more time setting that up, and then I'll walk through my thinking and process of paintings where I'm at today. And so I start with this image here titled A Portrait of Painting a Portrait Painting. And that's the title of this one, and this is the image of me painting this painting, which is a painting that I created. And so this was an opportunity for me to think about the impact and implications of the studio practice. What is it to kind of be in a space to create? And for me at that time, the studio space was one of the most secure places I could have. I was at University of Delaware when I made this. And they gave me a door and a key and a studio, and I couldn't believe that. Where, oftentimes growing up in transitional rooms and places, I never really had a true space to kind of call a studio. And so that was like my first time. And this painting here is a painting that I created during undergraduate research at University of Delaware, where I was a McNair Scholar. And it's significant because it represents the first time I ever considered art to creating art maybe about issues outside of it, but maybe, this created space for me to work more personally. And I ended up creating this image here of my best friend from home posed as the Lansdowne portrait where George Washington presents America to the world. That one's at the Portrait Gallery, I think, and in a White House. There's different copies of it. But anyway, so I'm using art historical references and people I know to create the painting. So those are like the terms that I'm working with when I'm kind of just getting started. But that really meant a lot to me, so I wanted to make a painting about me making that painting. And in that, I really learned that my studio process, it becomes this exchange, right, between the head, the heart, and the hand, this like kind of circulation and this activity, this presence in front of the canvas. And so that's why it's so important for me to see this work in person today as well. At that same time, or around that same time, I was making smaller, more intimate paintings from a body of work called Interior Series. These paintings are also of like family, friends, and people that I know and love. But they were at a smaller scale, about 9 by 12, a different type of stake. What happens if I can make this interior space to perhaps wrestle with a sense of in-between moments of the figure in a more intimate setting, but at a small, like pages in a notebook scale, whereas that previous painting was quite large. So I'm thinking about the scale and the impact of that on the read of the painting. At that same time, I became really invested in looking at these interior scene paintings down in DC. I was in graduate school in Baltimore, and I would take the MARC train down, and use really DC as like a second school and just spend time looking at this work in person. And I was attracted to the surface qualities and also the intimate scale of the early Dutch and Flemish works. But what I was also interested in is how I'm creating paintings of interior scenes, but the scenes are very different in my world versus the world back then in 1665. So how can I create paintings in a way that use the execution of a kind of academic formal technique, but to talk about my own insecurities and perhaps constructs of painting? I started researching more into this early Dutch and Flemish technique and landed on research about the 7-layer painting method that deals with black and white underpaintings and then thin layers of color on top to create an indirect impact of color. So instead of like taking pieces of paint and building an image, it really relies on subtlety and slowly building a surface. And what I was invested in with that was this conceptual act of what does it mean of the architecture of a painting or the architecture or construction of identity to work in this way. And so I returned to a self-portrait, but an attempt to kind of unpack this 7-layer painting method. And I was just trying to do like a straight up frontal view. And I was attempting to kind of work first with a drawing layer, then multiple umber neutral layers. And then the intention was to create this full black and white layer and then work colors of glaze on top. But I found something so compelling conceptually about this way of working. It was like, in order to understand color, you have to understand form first. And what does that mean when it can talk about identity, status, position, race, class? And so can I take that apart and use that as a way to look both inside and outside? Perhaps this is something that's both growing and receding. And so I never actually finished this painting the way I thought I would, but I left it in this state. And at about the same time, I did this. Long story short, I wanted to make like a life cast of my face, representationally, realistically. It didn't work. I was in my studio with McDonald's straws stuck up my nose so I could breathe. And that stuff was supposed to set in probably like 30 minutes. I was under there for like 3 hours, maybe two. And my studio assistant, the only way I could communicate with them was they would hand me a piece of paper. I had to feel it and try to write like what I was saying because I couldn't talk. But I had to remain calm, right? And while I was disappointed that that didn't work, right, the reality was it gave me so much more than this like perfect, realistic sculpture. It gave me the psychological state and impact of the underplaying, the person underneath the veil, the person underneath the mask, and my own wrestling with how to be heard, even though I'm seen. And I had the somehow awareness to know that was happening in the moment, I guess, and like, I was like, I want to set up a photo shoot. I trusted that the painting was there. I had my assistant kind of help me, and I posed like this. And I made a painting about that too, but I didn't put that in this presentation. But I knew that that was reference material, even though it was like a failure. And then, you know, the goop was in my eyes for like the rest of the week. I was picking crust out of my eyes each morning. And I can tell you, like, when I finally got out of that goop, as cheesy as it sounds, I was like reborn. It was like reimagining. I had a different appreciation for a whole lot of things. But just being able to communicate, right, was a big one too. So like, this became an important way of thinking about the construction of image and the power play that happens. I was kind of in a very, very vulnerable state, right, where the person that took this photograph, I had to have a lot of trust in them. And that led me to early 19th and 20th century portraiture, this image of Nicholas Biddle here from a visiting card. And Nicholas Biddle was one of the first injured in the Civil War. I think it was like 1863 or something like that. And, you know, he wasn't actually in control of this image. He was a subject, perhaps an object. This image was reproduced and used to raise money for the Union Army on a visiting card. So this image was like disseminated, probably without permission and all that stuff, right? But so I was really interested in this kind of psychological state of the sitter and trying to essentially put myself in that position, reflect on that, and then make a painting, not only about the position of the figure, but the psychological state underneath. And ironically, at the time, I was, maybe not ironically, I probably connected, but I was living near Biddle Street in Baltimore City as well. And you think about that name Biddle and like World Bank and all the history of the loaded terminology, right? So there was something that I was interested in, and I made this painting titled Progress After Biddle, thinking about the progress of, you know, how a figure constructs space, takes up space, and how the painting can be both resolving and unresolving at the same time. You know, those early photographs, I became obsessed with this, or fascinated with this idea that sitters would go through all these mechanical devices and kind of difficult poses for long exposures to create images of themselves that will outlive them and be passed down. So it was like this awareness of how you'll be seen beyond your time and going through all the levels of discomfort to hold a pose for 20 minutes. And I started kind of setting up a corner of my studio with poses and taping. You probably can't, there's like tape, and I would mark things. So I set up photo shoots in the corner of my studio, and I would create paintings that looked like this, using the 7-layer painting method. So this is a larger scale painting now. So it really becomes, in a way, photographic, then performance, or performance, then photographic, then painting. This kind of triangulation of self-assessment or experience. And I should say I'm working on wood panel here. That'll come into play later. But this was one of the first large paintings that I did on wood panel. But you know, the interest, so the painting ended up looking like this. And then later it would move around in the world in Baltimore like this. So the image would become disseminated around the world from a wood panel to a digital space, billboard size. And I found that interesting, like this kind of scale, macro, micro. And also the fact that these images and paintings you see here are objects. So this is my storage in Baltimore at the time. A collection of surfaces, but perhaps a collection of experiences as well. And the work would travel in different contexts that would then inform the work later. And so I went to Vermont Studio Center for a couple months, actually, after my graduate time in Baltimore at MICA. And this would influence a bit of the work, but I would also say this idea of how, whether you know it or not, context can get inside your work. And I'll speak more on that in a second. But I ended up making this painting here called On Stand. It was the first time I made like a double portrait, where now I'm like constructing in my head identities through a comparative relationship, a higher, thickly more white figure painted, slightly turned, and then a lower, thinner, darker, cooler figure painted, a little bit kind of looking off. And this really also helped me think about this 7-layer painting method, and not using straight up black and white at this point, but I am obsessing over mixing down from primary colors. So I'll mix all my paint during the day, and I do a lot of the painting at night, but I'll use the natural light to tilt like the temperature. And I'm thinking about temperature as a way to kind of construct power relationships, and then also the positioning of the figure to construct power relationships. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the lens of others. That's W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, a seminal text in 1903. This really becomes the engine of my research throughout the next, really throughout today, but especially like the next few images here. This two-way street of looking and being viewed, and what's at stake psychologically in that, and who's in control of that. How can painting perhaps be a space to authorize a new reality, both inside and outside? And so I made this painting titled After Brown. I made this painting when I was at Vermont Studio Center, and it was my first painting on aluminum substrate. This reference image was taken by African-American photographer Augustus Washington, where insurgent abolitionist John Brown declares war on slavery. And so he's making a declaration. At that time, I had a family member that was going through the criminal justice system, and I was not able to like be home and be there. And so for me, making a painting was a way to kind of authenticate presence. It was a way to create a testimony through perhaps, you know, the head, the heart, the hand. And so like I actually placed my hand onto the surface of the substrate in my view as a testimony, but in the painting techniques as an underpainting, but a print. And so I was in my studio painting every little finger, and I was going in. It was probably like 3 a.m, and I just was like, you know, I have this underpainting tone. And then the painting was done. And for me, it wasn't actually about the rendering, but it was about when the material meets the moment, and the moment was my need, right, to be heard even though I wasn't present. And so for me, it was like the painting can hold that presence because it can hold that tension. This was also a painting that I made on aluminum in a hot church building that was a studio. And I paint really thin, and so the paint would dry really quickly, and it was a struggle. And I hated this painting when I was working on it because it took a while to like figure out, but the paint would dry within a few hours, and that was a struggle for me. I would catch up to it later, and that's, I think, an example of sometimes your execution is ahead of your vision, and you kind of have to let things marinate a little bit to really figure out what it is you're doing. And here's some details of that handprint. And then I staged it happened. We talked about that. I was going to say that might happen. But so I end up staging a photo of like that handprint. That's not when I actually did it, but I was like, let me recreate that scene. You know, when I make a lot of these paintings, I use reference images. Like I'll take 50 images, and I might work from 3. I'll pose. I might raise an eyebrow, twitch an ear, slightly adjust poses, and I'll create an image based off of a composite of multiple images. But a lot of them don't work out. Special effects. So the ones that don't work were trash. They ended up becoming discarded photographs in my studio. But there's this kind of interest that I developed on the setup, right, of staging something and then how quickly you can say it doesn't work. And the crumple can exist it can happen in 5 seconds, but the staging took much longer. And then this idea of kind of reframing or reclaiming these. And so I ended up moving these around in my studio. I would hang them, I would group them with other objects, and I'd create vanitas still life paintings, referring to now these crumpled portraits. So these portraits became characters as I moved through the world. They gathered with things in my pocket, things on window ledges during specific moments in time. And here's an image of a set of vanitas paintings that I'm working. So you can see a comparison in scale next to a larger painting that I have on my wall. I'm now in New York at a residency. But again, this idea of working through an idea and not making a painting about an idea. And so I have these 2 bodies of works going at the same time. But again, the work is a material. And, you see that painting After Brown in the floor right there. In my home studio, actually, when I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2015, I was teaching high school full-time, and I was painting after. And, it became a really important moment in my trajectory because there's this idea that, the work travels with you and you can learn from it in different contexts as well. And so I'm constantly, when I'm grouping and pairing my works, I'm learning from it. When I do presentations and share my work, I often learn from it too. So it is like a live reflection throughout the journey. And so that painting there ended up looking like this. This oil on canvas. Now, at that time, I had the honor to go back to where I studied at University of Delaware and deliver a convocation address, a speech, which was a really special moment to return and be on stage with the graduating seniors there from the art program. I also had the opportunity to go back to my hometown high school on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and do the same thing. Around that time, too, I should say, when I was at UD, University of Delaware, I had that painting, the first one I showed in a slide as part of a museum show in their collection. which was literally right across kind of the parking lot from where that painting was made. And so it was like this full circle of also the reproduction of the image, the dissemination of the image, returning home where it was made. And it's a really special moment for me to kind of see that while I was there delivering a convocation address. But all of this kind of experience in the journey made me want to create paintings exactly about that. And so I started making what I would call regalia series paintings that deal with the inside and outside view of status, hierarchy, and costume. And this one is on aluminum. I scratched aluminum here. This one is on a wood panel. And so it became a really, I think, eye-opening experience to be on the other side of graduation as faculty and think about the human element, whether it's the ceremonial aspect of the school president coming out with like bling or a mace and people don't really know what it is, but they have it. Or everybody's the same, but then they kind of, outfit their own regalia to make it theirs, or the color of the hood to represent where you went to school. Or sitting on stage for 2 hours knowing a camera's on you, right? And essentially a long exposure. And so I was really interested in this kind of outside position, but this inside gesture or even maybe vulnerability. And so areas like the seams would often be exposed and areas of the image break down. I met the mayor in the city of Baltimore in 2019. This would be influential in my work. I had a solo show there called Rate of Contingency. And so this is an image of me and the mayor in a public opening, but a private walkthrough. Now, the public opening and private walkthrough essentially means that me and the mayor are going around my show with Secret Service boxing us in. So my friends and family who were there, I couldn't get to them, and I couldn't kind of share that conversation. So there was this kind of power play that was happening, but this human experience inside of that was locked inside of that would influence this work here. I made a painting about that experience with the mayor. I should say, I guess I left this out too. I'll go back. So, I got a mayoral salute from the mayor, and then 2 weeks later, the mayor got locked up. Right? But, my experience was human inside that perimeter, right? And so there's this intimate exchange that happens inside versus sometimes the outside public view that I had an opportunity to engage with. But I found that really a powerful moment to reflect on how the work can take you places and brush up against politics, humanness, if you will. And so these paintings are dealing now with that, but thinking about the format of the rectangle as both a perhaps part of the construction and part of the symbolic implications of content. So I'm thinking about orange, I'm thinking about purple, and I'm thinking about the green here. Now I should say that the green, there's actual tape on the right and left side, and then I painted the top and bottom, right, with oil paint. And then this is all paint. So this idea of where things are painted, things are locked in conceptually. Where things are taped, things can be undone. And so I'm always interested in how in particularly portraiture, how a figure can be positioned but also undone. How does the paint unfold to share more than the surface? Here's a painting on aluminum that attempts to do that. And now I started really getting more peculiar and particular with the surfaces of aluminum, thinking about a horizontal aluminum grain versus a vertical, and how that has a relationship to the gesture of the mark, not just the image. And a horizontal grain on aluminum catches light differently. And so my really interest at this point is, how can light hit beneath the surface and bounce around in it? And so it really forces, I hope, one to spend time with the work beyond the surface. So they're hard to document, and you kind of got to move around to see the totality of things. The work travels in spaces and is grouped with artists as well, which helped me think about my own work in its context. And so I started thinking about the silhouette and weight. And I made this larger scale vanitas painting, now with larger than life scale silhouettes. This would lead me to a more, I think, explicit body of work dealing with vanitas that deals with the construction of the crumpled photo itself, where the image often refers to, or the substrate, like the surface is painted on, refers to the image that's painted. Metal that's painted is often on a metal ground where things can be put together or taken apart. This painting here is a very pivotal painting in my newest journey, my newest kind of trajectory. This image here is an image of my grandfather, probably at about 19, who I never had a chance to meet. And so I started connecting with family that I actually didn't know I had in my hometown. And that opened up a new space to see pictures of people that looked like me, but I only could learn stories from. And so I thought about making paintings to try to recreate or make a relationship with those people. And so in this way, I created a double portrait, which historically is often used in creating relationships with people, often like, husband and wife, brother and sister. But I'm like, I guess, my grandfather, grandson. And I dug even deeper into the archives at a place called Sumner Hall in my hometown of Chestertown, Maryland, in Kent County. And I learned that I had a grandfather or an uncle there that I didn't know I had. And this was like 2019. And he was the president of Sumner Hall, which is essentially one of two, I think, remaining standing sites for African American veterans that served in the military. And growing up in my hometown, especially during that time, you didn't really hear too much about the local history there. You heard more national history, but you didn't really understand how close it was to home. And so when I returned and learned that I had an uncle there that was the president there, that gave me access to, new relationships with the present and the past. And I learned that I had a great, 4 times great, I believe, or 3 times great. It might be 4, it might even be further back. John Hackett, that served in the Union Army during the Civil War. This would impact my work and research moving forward, things that I'm still thinking about. This is also my grandfather. He's 19 there, and then there he is, a little bit older. These kind of artifactual images or evidence would make their way into my work. But now at this time, it's a very challenging time for the nation, and this is in 2020 in the summer. And I'm in my studio in Washington, D.C., like a little 6x8 studio, making paintings and then going out and connecting with context. Now, the connection also offers a form of reflection in this moment. And I put this in here so you can see how I work too, like the indirect layers, and that's on aluminum. But so me working in this small 6x8 studio with the impact of the world around made me consider spatial relations, a triangulation. It was also during the kind of start of the pandemic. And so I made a painting titled New Contention. I made that painting during that time. I think I probably was staring at a lot of walls. But I guess I say, too, that I use my studio practice not always as a literal way to resist, or a literal form of resistance, but it provides a space to slow down, a space to control the pace, at your own pace, if you wanted to. And so that's what this painting represents for me, is this kind of triangulation of the pace of activity and reflecting and contending with that. I would see myself a lot in the Zoom images, and I would see like these really low-res images on that web camera, and then compress like architecture in the space behind me. And I'd make these small-scale silhouette paintings. And on a wall, they would look like this. They would look like little Zoom boxes, I guess. But so again, the context comes into the work. And I wanted to try to make now a larger painting dealing with those silhouettes that look like this. So I'm going to move through a next kind of series of images that represent recent work and things that I'm still thinking about. I made a painting titled after Private John Hackett. It's thinking about and reflecting on my ancestor and the role that they played in the Union Army. And interestingly enough, in even more recent research, I found that they made it back home after the war, and had a role to play on the first Juneteenth as well in Texas at that time. And so I'm still thinking about that in the work. I didn't actually know that when I made the painting, and so I'm catching up to that. But this is on aluminum and scratched aluminum. So I would take an X-Acto blade and scratch areas to think about, again, the underplaying or the psychological position of a pose. Here's another one around that same time. You'll see here, seams and zippers remain undone. This one here. So if you remember that painting I did after Brown, I wanted to make a back version of that painting as another testimony in a way that compresses space. And so this is called After Return Investment. The wood frame is part of the work. I guess the orange, brown is the underpainting there, peeking through. You may recognize this photo from my references. And so this is probably the most recent kind of reference points of my work, where I'm taking these family photographs more explicitly and painting them not only as the people, but as the photograph themselves, and transposing that with myself that's somewhat slightly awkward, maybe a little bit out of proportion, slipping out of the frame, but trying to create a relationship that didn't exist. And the interesting kind of note is this is one of those club pictures, where people would have the fake backdrops, and often they would go out to Baltimore and do that, or I would learn that some of these photo companies would travel to the Eastern Shore of Maryland every once in a while, and people would wear their best, and they would create these poses. And it became really special to make these images, but it's I painted that face before. The features, I can see relationships there as well, but it really kind of got me thinking about the difference between family archive and a national archive here. In other words, images you get from your family and images that are like institutionalized. Here's some details of that painting. And so in a research trip to Birmingham in like 2023, I visited the A.G. Gadsden Motel, which is it plays a significant role in the civil rights history. It was Reprieve, a place where a lot of the black activists, including Malcolm X, Dr. King, would go. And it was a safe haven. It was one of the places that had like AC, during that time. And it's interesting, like the life story of this building is one that had a certain kind of pride, but then got left forgotten and then got reclaimed by the Smithsonian, as now is part of the kind of National Smithsonian Institution. I'm not going to say enterprise, institution. And what they have there is they have these like markers where like people stood, and so that's the exact place that Dr. King stood. So what did I do? I went there with the camera, and I used this to kind of create reference material for my next work, where I put myself in the position of where people were, and then try to make paintings about that. I had a show in Birmingham too that was called Circular Narratives, and I made these digital reproductions of those interior series paintings, and now I folded them up. So like the self-referential kind of painted image is now a new work. And so I'm thinking about this circulation or dissemination of images across planes or across pictorial spaces now at this point. Works today in my studio look like this. So I'm taking these self-referential or these reference images, cutting them up and reassembling them in paint. But I'm interested in like the buy-in of trompe l'oeil as well. It's almost like a bait in a way to construct space or flatten it. And so this is my studio floor and the painting on the floor. But returning back to the A.G. Gadsden Motel, I made a painting that looks like this. Let's walk through this painting because images are tricky. So it's me, my brother, and my best friend from home transposed with that brochure image artifact. Funny, the gallery was like taking pictures of this and they thought that was like tape, real tape, so they cropped it out. But like, no, that's paint, that's part of the work. Here's some cell phone images of recent work. Hasn't been shown yet, so stay tuned. But these are my, like the Hackett, Walter Hackett, who's kind of like a close descendant of John Hackett, and the father of my grandfather, too, in the painting. So then I made a painting about them. And it's almost like the more destroyed or deteriorated the photograph is, the more exciting the painting can be. Like when the information isn't there, you have to find it with the material of paint. And in fact, that's the only thing that's real. Like I can hear stories about the individuals, I can see photographs, I can reproduce it, but the thing that's real is paint. So the things you do are on the surface. The things you don't do are also sometimes visible. And for me, that really charges the space. This is Arminita Walker, my grandma Minnie, they called her, from like mid-1800s, another photograph I got taken. Arminita's Harriet Tubman's real name, and so I learned that as well. And during that time, if you think about a woman named after Harriet Tubman, it's almost a form of resistance within itself and the impact of a name, right? So I'm making a painting about that. This is actually a study for that painting on my floor. I see Joe Biden more than you might think. This is me and Joe Biden. And being in DC, I mean, that's how things sometimes happen. But interesting part is, again, like the Secret Service and the boundary, similar to like when I met the mayor. But then the exchange talking as a human to the individual within those parameters. And then the repetition of like constantly seeing somebody and thinking you know them, but do you really, especially when there's a political image or idea of who they are, how does that align or misalign with expectations? And like everybody asks me, like, oh, how is it really? And it's like, well, I'll make a painting about it. So this is what I'm making a painting about it now, actually, in my studio there. And that painting is going to be in a show soon at Goya Contemporary in Baltimore. And my studio situation with my studio assistant down there sleeping. And my studio assistant giving me a critique. Thank you. Out of 800, it's like, what, 5% or 6%, something like that. And so that was a real, it's a real privilege to even be here today. So I'm going to start with the honorable mention. The honorable mention is Russell Pre-Joe-Dutch. Is Russell here? Russell's work spoke to us during the talk and is the work back there behind the column.
The beast that fell.
He is here, though.
He's here?
No, I'm saying
He's here. He's with us. All right, we have a third place award. Is going to go to Zenite Gelly, whose work is a large painting on the wall across from us with fabric pieces. Is Zenite here? I hope some of y'all are here. Our second place award is going to go to Sarah Mendez. Sarah's painting is the one underneath of the title of the show. And first place award goes to Ann Stoddard. Is Ann here? Congratulations. Ann is the video piece in the corner. And I have to say congratulations to each of you for sharing your work and putting it out in the world. And I hope you have a chance to exchange, talk to each other. I'll be around as well. But I want to just thank you again for taking time out to sharing your work with me and the Del Paine Art Center and putting it in the world. So thanks again.